I never thought much about death until it became my job. People like to imagine morgues as something distant, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and steel doors, but for me, the basement is where I spend most of my waking hours. It's not glamorous. It's not romantic. It's just where the bodies go when life has run its course, or when it's been cut short too soon. The hospital morgue is buried deep underground, past a service corridor few staff ever use. You don't stumble across it by accident. You have to know where you're going. Down the elevator that rattles like it hasn't been serviced in years, through a pair of reinforced fire doors, and into a corridor that always seems colder than it should be. I learned quickly that once you cross that threshold, you're in another world entirely, one without sunlight, windows, or reminders that life exists anywhere outside. The smell hits first. Not decay as you might think. That's rare since refrigeration keeps things sealed tight. No, it's the sterile tang of cleaning chemicals, sharp and artificial, clinging to every surface. There's also the faint metallic bite of cold air that carries a weight of stillness. I remember during my first week, pausing at the threshold and wondering if I could handle that quiet. Hospitals upstairs were noisy, frantic, always alive with motion. Down here in the morgue, time itself feels like it stops. The layout is simple. Rows of steel drawers stacked like filing cabinets, each one holding someone who had a name, a history, a heartbeat once. Now they're reduced to numbered tags and paperwork. There's a central workstation where I spend most of my hours, logging arrivals and departures, checking refrigeration levels, making sure every entry matches its file. Routine, repetitive work, the kind of thing that dulls your senses if you let it. But what unsettled me, even from the start, was the atmosphere. You'd think death would bring silence, and it does, but it's not an empty silence. It's dense, pressing in as if the walls are listening. At first I thought it was just my imagination, some trick of working alone in a place most people avoid, but the feeling never went away. The fluorescent lights overhead hum constantly, their buzz as steady as a pulse. Sometimes one flickers, leaving the room in a stuttered rhythm of light and shadow. In those moments I feel exposed, as if something could shift in the corner while the bulb struggles to keep steady. I tell myself it's nothing, just failing wiring in an old building, but deep down a small part of me braces every time it happens. I've seen enough death to know the morgue isn't a place of drama. Bodies don't sit up, drawers don't slide open on their own. The real horror, if there is any, is the banality of it. Cold, motionless figures shrouded in white sheets, drawers labeled with last names and dates, paperwork filled out in neat handwriting. That should be enough to numb you. But even when everything is still, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the corners of the room expecting to see something. It isn't uncommon for me to hear sounds I can't quite explain. A faint knock against metal when no one else is on the floor. A shuffle so soft I convince myself it's the building settling. Once, during a long shift, I thought I heard a sigh. A long, breathy exhale echoing through the air vents. I checked every room, every unit, even the hall outside, but I found nothing. The air was still. The bodies were all where they were supposed to be. I told myself it was fatigue. Everyone who works nights eventually starts imagining things. Your mind craves stimulation, so it invents small frights to fill the void. That's what I said to myself anyway. Still, there's a reason I always hesitate at the threshold before starting my shift. A reason my stomach knots in that instant before I step inside. I've never been able to shake it. The morgue isn't just a workplace, it's a threshold itself. A border between what's living and what isn't. And spending hours down here, surrounded by those who've crossed over, leaves me with a weight I can't quite name. Some nights, when the air feels heavier than usual, I catch myself thinking of shadows. How they move just slightly different when the lights flicker. How something might be crouched between the drawers, too still to notice until it chooses to shift. I try not to dwell on it. Imagination is dangerous here. If you let your thoughts wander too far, they'll lead you to places you don't want to go. I've worked here long enough to know the routine by heart. Log the body, check the temperature, fill out the form, update the system. Yet even with the predictability, I feel watched. Not in the way you feel in a crowded room, but in the way you feel when standing at the edge of a dark forest at night. Aware of the unseen, of eyes that may or may not be there. I never speak aloud in the morgue. Not even to myself. The silence feels too absolute, and breaking it feels like an invitation. Sometimes I think the air is waiting for me to make a mistake, to acknowledge something I shouldn't. So I stay quiet, doing my work with deliberate, efficient motions. I don't linger longer than necessary. I've grown used to people upstairs joking when they find out what I do. They say things like, "Aren't you scared one of them might sit up?" I laugh with them because it's easier than explaining the truth. Bodies don't rise. They don't walk. They don't speak. What's frightening isn't what they do. It's what the morgue itself seems to hold inside its walls. The hospital basement has become my world, though I'm not sure if it's one I'll ever fully belong to. Every night when I descend, I feel like I'm leaving something behind, stepping out of the realm of the living and into another. I tell myself it's just a job, that I'm imagining the shadows, the faint sounds, the weight in the air. But even in the beginning, before anything strange truly happened, I knew this place carried secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. And sometimes when I'm alone down there, I can't shake the thought that the dead aren't as still as they should be. Most of my nights follow the same rhythm, and I've come to rely on that rhythm as a shield. Routine, after all, is comforting. When you can predict every step, every movement, every sound, it leaves less room for your mind to wander. And in the morgue, wandering thoughts are dangerous. I usually start my shift with the logs. Every body that arrives in the basement is tagged, filed, and cataloged. Its details added to the system. Name, date of birth, cause of death if available, time of arrival. If the cause of death is pending autopsy, I mark it as such. It's bureaucratic work, but essential. Paperwork doesn't care if the air feels heavy or if the shadows seem to linger longer than they should. Paperwork is order. Once the logs are updated, I check the refrigeration units. There are rows of dials along the back wall, each one corresponding to a set of drawers. Temperatures must remain consistent. Too warm and decomposition begins too quickly. Too cold, and there's a risk of damaging tissue. The hum of the refrigeration system is constant, a low vibration that blends with the fluorescent buzz overhead. It's the sound of stillness being preserved, and I've come to depend on it. If the hum ever stops, it means something's wrong. Sometimes bodies arrive in the early hours, wheeled in by tired attendants who say little and leave quickly. They rarely linger. The morgue makes people uneasy, even those who've worked in hospitals for years. I've seen nurses drop off a body without making eye contact, as if acknowledging the place too directly might leave a mark on them. I don't blame them. The walls here have a way of holding your attention too tightly. When a body needs to be prepared for an autopsy, I'm responsible for the preliminary steps, laying it out on the table, confirming identification, arranging the necessary instruments. Everything is methodical, clinical, stripped of sentiment. The living are sentimental about death. The dead themselves, though, they demand efficiency. I don't let myself think of them as people anymore. Not really. They're cases, numbers, tags. It's the only way to get through the night without breaking down. But no matter how detached I try to be, there are moments I can't ignore. Moments when the silence seems to fracture. I'll be filling out a form at the workstation when I hear a faint sound like a whisper carried through the ventilation ducts. Too soft to make out words, but insistent enough to notice. The first time it happened, I froze, pen suspended above paper, listening so hard I thought my ears might burst. Then it stopped. I told myself it was just airflow, nothing more. But it's happened enough times now that I can't dismiss it completely. Sometimes the lights flicker while I'm working at the table, and for the briefest instant, I see the shadows of the drawers stretch unnaturally across the floor. They don't move, not really, not in a way I could prove. But in that flicker of semi-darkness, they seem to bend, to reach, as though they're aware of me standing there. By the time the light steadies, everything is as it should be. Still, my hands always tremble just a little afterward. Late at night, when the paperwork is caught up and the refrigeration checks are complete, I find myself sitting at the workstation, staring at the rows of drawers. There's something about their symmetry. Cold metal doors, each identical except for the small tags hanging from their handles, that feels unnatural, like a hive of something dormant, waiting. I catch myself counting them sometimes as though expecting the number to change. The morgue, for all its sterility, has a presence. I don't mean that figuratively. There are moments when I feel it watching me. Not the bodies, at least not individually, but the room itself. The air grows thick, pressing against my chest. My movements feel heavier, as though someone or something is tracking each one. It never lasts long, just enough to set my nerves on edge before fading again, leaving me staring into empty corners. I remember one night in particular, when everything was too quiet. The refrigeration hum, the fluorescent buzz, they were there but softer, somehow muted, as though muffled by a heavy blanket. I looked up from the paperwork and realized I hadn't heard a single noise from upstairs in hours. No footsteps, no elevator shutter, no carts rolling across tile. The hospital might as well have been abandoned. In that silence, the morgue felt alive, breathing in a way that wasn't mine. I shook it off, forced myself back to the forms, but even as I wrote, I couldn't escape the sensation that I was not alone. I glanced toward the rows of drawers, half expecting one to slide open. None did. And yet the certainty that I was being watched didn't fade until I left for the night, stepping back into the world above where the noise of life drowned out whatever waited below. These are the kinds of things I don't tell anyone. My colleagues would laugh, call it nerves, or worse, paranoia. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe I am imagining it all. But if that's the case, why does the unease grow stronger every week? Why does the morgue feel more aware the longer I work here? As though it's learning me, memorizing me. Routine is supposed to ground you, to make the strange fade into the background. For most jobs, that's true. But in the morgue, routine doesn't protect you. It only highlights the moments when something breaks it. And when that happens, you realize how fragile the barrier really is. How easily the ordinary can fracture into something else. I keep telling myself that the morgue is just a room. That bodies are just bodies. That silence is just silence. But even now, as I sit at the desk finishing paperwork under the harsh glow of the lights, I can't ignore the prickle on the back of my neck. I can't shake the thought that if I were to look up suddenly, I might catch one of those drawers shifting ever so slightly. So I don't look. I keep my eyes on the forms, on the routine, on the numbers in the files and the ink drying on paper. I keep my head down because looking too closely at this place feels like inviting something in. And though nothing has happened yet, nothing I can prove, I know enough to fear what might happen if I give the morgue the attention it seems to want. That's the truth of working among the dead. The bodies themselves aren't frightening. What's frightening is how the morgue breathes around them. It was during one of those long, late shifts when the routine first began to crack. At that hour, the hospital above feels like it's gone to sleep. The corridors are mostly empty. Nurses whispering to one another at dimmed stations, the occasional squeak of a cleaning cart's wheel echoing down the halls. By the time you reach the morgue, even those faint reminders of life vanish. The basement becomes a sealed world cut off from the rest. I had been updating a log, noting the arrival of a man in his late 50s. Cardiac arrest, transferred from ICU. Everything about him was ordinary. No special markings, no pending forensic hold, no need for autopsy yet. Just another body to be cataloged, stored, and forgotten. I slid the drawer shut, heard the latch click into place, and returned to my desk. That's when I heard it. A faint sound. Not the refrigeration hum, not the buzzing light, a scrape. Metal on metal. Soft but deliberate, like the whisper of a drawer sliding an inch inside its track. I froze, pen hovering above the page. The air seemed to thicken, every hair on my arm standing upright. I waited, straining to hear over the steady buzz. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was the mechanics. These drawers are old, heavy, not perfectly aligned. Sometimes they shift when the cooling cycles kick in. It happens. That's what I said as I forced myself to keep writing. My hand shook a little, the letters uneven, but I didn't look up again until the form was complete. Still, the scrape lingered in my head. Later that night, I made another round to check temperatures. Everything was steady within range. But when I reached the far row, something caught my eye. The drawer I'd closed earlier, the one with the man from ICU, didn't look quite right. The handle was tilted slightly outward, just enough to suggest the latch hadn't caught. I remember staring at it, my breath shallow, debating whether to touch it. It could have been my mistake. I might not have pushed it fully shut, but I could still hear the click in my memory as clear as if it had just happened. I gripped the handle, heart pounding, and tugged it open. The body was there, lying exactly as I had placed it. White sheet tucked neatly, tag secured to the toe. Nothing unusual. I adjusted the drawer, pushed it in firmly until it latched, and even tugged once to make sure it held. It did. By the time I sat back at the desk, I'd convinced myself it was fatigue. It had to be. But the next night, something stranger happened. I was logging an older woman brought in from a nursing home. When I went to file her paperwork, I noticed a gap in the logbook. One tag number didn't match the records. A small error, but I pride myself on precision. I went to double-check the drawers, cross-referencing each name and tag. That's when I saw it. The man from ICU, his tag was missing. The toe tag I had carefully secured was gone. In its place was nothing but pale, bare skin. For a moment I thought I'd misplaced it, that maybe it had fallen off into the sheet. I lifted the edge, hands trembling despite myself, and searched. Nothing. I stepped back, trying to stay calm, but something else caught my eye. His arms. I could have sworn when I laid him out they were crossed neatly over his chest. That's how we position most arrivals. Orderly, respectful. But now they were at his sides, palms flat against the sheet, fingers curled slightly as if he'd been resting. I stood there, staring, waiting for my mind to make sense of it. Had I positioned him differently without realizing? Had the tag torn off when I pulled the drawer shut the night before? It was possible. That's what I told myself. Possible. But the longer I looked, the more impossible it felt. I forced myself to redo the tag, writing his details on a fresh card and tying it firmly to his foot. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I checked the other drawers twice, 3 times, making sure nothing else had changed. All seemed in order. When I returned to my desk, I found the missing tag lying on the floor near the workstation. No blood, no tears, no sign it had snapped or been cut. Just lying there as if placed carefully where I would find it. I didn't sleep well after that shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, slack and pale under the fluorescent light. His arms positioned wrong, his body just slightly different from how I remembered. I told myself it was exhaustion. I'd been working too many nights in a row. Memory plays tricks. It had to be that. And yet the next evening when I descended the elevator, I hesitated longer than usual at the morgue doors. My badge hovered in front of the scanner, my pulse uneven. I had to force myself to swipe to step inside to face the silence once more. Inside, everything appeared normal. The hum was steady, the lights buzzing faintly overhead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air was heavier, thicker, like the morgue itself was holding its breath. I went through my routine, trying to cling to the comfort of order. But each time I passed that drawer, I slowed, my eyes flicking toward the handle. It remained shut, latch secure, tag in place. And yet the certainty never left me. Something had moved. Something had changed. That was the first time I allowed myself to wonder if the morgue wasn't just pressing on me. If maybe it was pressing back. If the stillness wasn't as absolute as I'd always believed. And once that thought took root, there was no shaking it. After that first week of small, almost deniable disturbances, I wanted nothing more than to slip back into routine. To pretend that the scrape of the drawer, the missing tag, the changed position of a corpse were all just mistakes. My mistakes. Fatigue, distraction, poor memory. That's what I told myself each night as I descended into the basement. But the morgue wasn't content to let me forget. The changes started subtle, nearly imperceptible. One morning, while doing final checks before leaving, I noticed that a body I'd left with its eyes closed now stared at the ceiling. At first I thought perhaps I hadn't shut the lids firmly enough. Sometimes they resist, the skin tightening as it cools. But when I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, waxy skin, I realized the lids weren't stiff at all. They moved easily when I pressed them shut, as though someone had opened them deliberately after I'd left. Another night, while logging a younger man awaiting autopsy, I realized his hands were positioned differently from the night before. They'd been folded neatly, one over the other. Now they lay apart, palms up, fingers curled inward as if frozen mid-motion. It was so slight, so easy to dismiss as a trick of memory, and yet I couldn't shake the image of him shifting in the drawer, slowly uncurling his arms while I worked at the desk just feet away. I began writing everything down. Not just the official logs, but a private notebook I kept hidden in my locker. I recorded how I left each body positioned, where each tag was tied, whether eyes were open or closed. Every small detail that could later betray a change. It was a way to keep myself grounded, to prove, if only to myself, that I wasn't losing my mind. At first, the entries were sparse. 1 or 2 questionable changes. A missing toe tag here, a strange position there. But as the days went on, the notebook filled with inconsistencies. A body turned slightly to one side. A jaw that had dropped open between shifts, though I was certain I'd secured it with a band. a drawer that felt heavier to pull than before, as if its occupant were resisting from within. I mentioned these things once to a pair of orderlies during a body transfer. They laughed, told me everyone hears stories like that when they first start in the morgue. "Don't let the place get to you," one said with a grin, wheeling a gurney back toward the elevator. "It's just nerves. The dead stay dead." Their tone was casual, dismissive, but behind their eyes I thought I saw something else, something like recognition. Later, I worked up the courage to bring it up to one of the senior attendants, a man who'd been here longer than anyone else. His expression hardened the moment I hinted at what I'd seen. He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned close, his voice dropping low as though the very walls might overhear. "The basement keeps its own rules," he said. "Nothing more." Then he turned away, refusing to answer my questions. His words unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. They sounded like a warning, not advice. And they made me wonder just how much he'd seen himself, how many strange details he'd ignored or buried under routine. The changes grew bolder after that. One evening, I opened a drawer to find the sheet entirely undone, as though the body had rolled beneath it. I knew I had tucked it tightly the night before. The folds had been neat, precise. Now it was loose, the body exposed, limbs splayed as if it had shifted violently in its sleep. Another time, while checking temperatures, I passed a row of drawers and stopped cold. One handle was slick, damp with condensation, though the others around it were dry. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer. A faint trickle of water had formed at the base, darkening the floor tile. But when I pulled the drawer open, the refrigeration was working perfectly. The body inside lay still, the air crisp and cold. There was no explanation for the condensation, no leak in the system. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the drawer itself had sweated. By then I'd stopped trying to tell myself it was fatigue. The evidence in my notebook was too consistent, too deliberate. Someone or something was interfering with the bodies when I wasn't watching. And then came the night I saw it with my own eyes. I was finishing paperwork, the morgue heavy with silence, when I caught movement at the edge of my vision. Just a flicker, a shift in the corner. I looked up quickly, heart hammering, and for a split second I could have sworn one of the drawers was sliding inward, as if it had been ajar and was pulled shut just as I turned. The sound reached me an instant later. A metallic click, soft but undeniable. I stood, every muscle tense, and stared across the rows. All the drawers were closed, handles aligned, tags in place. Nothing seemed amiss, and yet I could still feel it. The lingering echo of motion, the certainty that something had just changed in front of me. I backed away, pulse thudding in my ears, my notebook clutched tightly in one hand. I didn't dare check. I couldn't. The incidents never happened all at once, never dramatic enough to catch anyone else's attention. That's what made them so unbearable. They were small, deliberate, and undeniable when stacked together. The morgue was toying with me, shifting its stillness just enough to make me doubt myself, to wear me down night after night. I tried to remind myself of the attendant's words. The basement keeps its own rules. I wanted to believe there was a logic to it, some explanation hidden beneath layers of old stories and whispered warnings. But the more I witnessed, the more it felt less like rules and more like awareness. The bodies weren't just lying still, they were waiting. The first time I was assigned an overnight shift alone, I told myself it would be no different than any other evening. I had been in the basement countless nights already. I had heard the whispers through the vents, felt the change in weight when pulling drawers, seen the logs contradict themselves. But there had always been others nearby, if only in the floors above. The hospital hummed faintly with life during those hours. Machines, distant chatter, footsteps echoing down empty halls. This time, there was nothing. The supervisor's tone was casual when he told me, "A scheduling gap, an emergency upstairs, no one else available. You'll be fine," he said, handing me the keys as if the weight of the decision meant nothing at all. I descended into the basement with a heaviness in my chest. The stairwell seemed longer than usual, each step echoing too loudly, swallowed by silence before it reached the bottom. When I opened the morgue door, the usual chill rushed to meet me, carrying that sterile metallic tang of preservative air. But the silence was absolute. Even the soft hum of refrigeration units felt muted, restrained. The first hour passed without incident. I busied myself with routine, checking the temperature logs, tightening the seals on drawers, adjusting sheets. Paperwork gave my hands something to do, my mind something to focus on. Yet even then I couldn't ignore the way every sound I made seemed amplified. The scratch of my pen, the shuffle of paper, the faint creak of my chair. All of it bounced off the tiled walls and came back distorted, wrong somehow. It was in that distortion that the dread grew. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see something waiting just behind me. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint scrape, metallic and deliberate. The sound of drawer against rail. My head snapped toward the far wall, heart pounding. All the drawers were shut, perfectly aligned. The silence resumed, pressing harder than before. I forced myself to stand, legs trembling despite my efforts to steady them. My hand hovered above the logbook. Part of me wanted to write it down immediately, to mark the time, the sound, the impression. But another part of me recoiled at the thought of recording it, as if putting the sound into words would give it permanence. Instead, I clenched the pen until my knuckles ached and stepped forward. The scrape came again, sharper this time, unmistakable. I crossed the room slowly, every instinct screaming to turn back. The drawer at the center of the row seemed ordinary, its handle glinting in the overhead light. But the sound had come from here, I was certain. My breath fogged faintly against the chilled air as I reached out, hand trembling, and gripped the handle. The metal was colder than usual, biting against my skin. With one steady pull, I slid the drawer open. The body lay exactly as expected. A middle-aged man, sheet tucked neatly to his chin, eyes sealed. Still lifeless, harmless. Nothing stirred. I let the drawer rest open, staring for far too long, waiting for some twitch, some flutter of movement. Nothing came. I pushed the drawer back, the rails screeching louder than they should have, the sound filling the morgue like a cry. When the drawer clicked shut, silence followed, but not emptiness. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I returned to the desk, trying to convince myself I had imagined it all. That's when I heard the footsteps, soft, measured, deliberate. They came from the corridor outside, slow and uneven, the heel of each step dragging slightly against the floor. I froze. No one was supposed to be here. The morgue was sealed at night, the access doors upstairs locked. Yet the sound persisted, drawing closer, echoing faintly through the closed door. I stood slowly, pulse thudding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. I waited, staring at the door, every muscle tense. My mind scrambled for explanations. A nurse lost on the wrong floor, an orderly checking in. But no knock followed, no key rattled in the lock. Only silence. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door. My hand reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the sound came again. Not outside this time, but faintly, impossibly, from behind me. Footsteps, inside the morgue. I spun around, breath caught in my throat. The room was empty. The rows of drawers gleamed under fluorescent light. The desk sat untouched. The floor stretched wide and bare, and yet I knew with an icy certainty that the sound had come from within these walls. A cold sweat ran down my spine. I backed slowly toward the desk, refusing to turn my back on the drawers. Every shadow seemed deeper, every handle a pair of watching eyes. My own breathing sounded foreign, unnatural. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost its shape. I forced myself to sit, gripping the logbook with trembling hands. I wrote it down this time, scrawling in messy, uneven lines. Footsteps. Not outside, inside. The words steadied me, gave the terror form, but they didn't explain it. The rest of the night stretched endlessly. Every flicker of the lights made my chest seize. Every faint shift in the hum of the refrigeration units felt like a whisper just out of reach. I didn't hear the scrape again, or the footsteps, but the silence was worse than either. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, until I could no longer tell whether I was awake or drifting on the edge of nightmare. When the morning finally came and I climbed the stairwell into the weak light of day, I expected relief. Instead, I carried the silence with me, lodged deep in my chest as though the morgue itself had followed me upward. That was the first time I understood the true weight of being alone down there. Not just the solitude, not just the silence, but the knowledge that in that basement, isolation wasn't emptiness. It was presence. Something had been there with me that night, watching, waiting. After the night alone, I realized I couldn't rely on memory alone anymore. Every detail blurred together under exhaustion and fear, and I began to wonder if I was creating the patterns myself. Maybe the footsteps were echoes. Maybe the scraping was the sound of metal cooling. Maybe the paranoia was seeping in because I wanted it to. But another voice inside me argued louder. No, you need proof. So, I began documenting everything. At first, it was just the logbook. I wrote more than the standard notes, temperature checks, intake times, drawer numbers. I filled pages with tiny details. Which sheet had a wrinkle at the corner, which toe tag hung at an angle, which drawer handle bore a faint scratch in the metal. My handwriting turned frantic, cramped, obsessive. Each shift became a ritual of inventory, a battle against the shifting certainty in my head. Then, I brought in a camera. It wasn't hospital-issued, of course. Just an old digital recorder I had lying around at home. I tucked it discreetly onto a shelf above the main rows of drawers, angled so it captured the majority of the room. I told myself it was harmless, a little insurance. No one needed to know but me. The first nights of footage were uneventful. I scrolled through the recordings with mounting frustration, watching hours of empty stillness. The light flickered occasionally and shadows shifted in the corners, but nothing I could point to with confidence. Nothing that said, "See, you're not losing your mind." But then came the fourth night. At first, it was subtle. Around 2:30 a.m., the camera picked up a twitch. Not mine, I wasn't even in frame. A body, drawer number 7, middle row, its hand. A small flex of the fingers beneath the sheet. So quick and so slight it could have been dismissed as the shifting of fabric. I replayed it dozens of times, frame by frame. The sheet lifted barely a fraction, the outline of fingers pressing from beneath. No trick of light, no mechanical fault. The following night it happened again. Different drawer, different body. This time the head turned. Not much, just a few degrees, enough for the chin to angle toward the lens. The movement was slow, deliberate, and then perfectly still again. I remember sitting at my desk with the footage paused on that frame, my own reflection faint in the dark screen. The corpse's eyes were closed, the skin pale and waxy, but the head had shifted undeniably toward the camera, as though it knew it was being watched. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the recorder. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. My head swam with questions I didn't dare say aloud. I kept thinking of the logs I'd written, the missing tag, the scraping drawer. All of it lined up now, weaving together into a pattern I could no longer dismiss as exhaustion. Still, part of me fought back with rationalizations. Bodies move sometimes, I reminded myself. Muscle spasms, post-mortem reflexes, trapped gases. The literature explained these things. But not days after death. Not synchronized, deliberate movements that stopped the instant they were observed. Not faces turning toward the camera. The next time I went down into the basement, the silence felt heavier. I caught myself glancing at the very drawers I knew had shifted. I half expected them to burst open at my approach, but they stayed sealed, as if mocking me with their stillness. I doubled my documentation. Multiple cameras now, hidden in corners, tucked behind supply carts, even balanced on top of the refrigeration unit. I wrote logs in duplicate, one for the official records, one in a private notebook I kept locked in my locker. My world narrowed to the basement, my notes, the footage, the bodies, and then came the recording that stripped away my last doubts. It was around 3:15 a.m. The room was quiet, shadows long across the tiles. One of the bodies on the lower row shifted. First the toes curled, pressing against the sheet. Then the hand slid outward, fingers clawing at the air before falling limp again. The worst part wasn't the movement. It was the way the body seemed to pause, to hold that moment as though aware of its own performance before collapsing back into perfect stillness. And the camera caught everything. I watched it over and over, nausea twisting my stomach. Every time I hoped to see some glitch, some digital artifact, some static to explain it away. But the picture remained flawless, clear, undeniable. I didn't know whether to feel validated or horrified. For weeks I had questioned my sanity, doubted every sound and sight. Now I had proof, concrete evidence that something inhuman was happening in the morgue. But with proof came a greater fear. Because if this was real, then nothing in my world was safe anymore. The next day I tried telling a colleague. I chose carefully. A technician who had worked in the basement before, someone I thought might understand. I spoke quietly, cautiously, framing it as a strange occurrence. I mentioned the noises, the shifting tags, the drawer that scraped. He laughed. Not cruelly, just with the easy dismissal of someone who had no reason to believe otherwise. Bodies do that sometimes, he said. Gas release muscle contractions. You'll get used to it. I didn't mention the recordings. I couldn't, because a deeper fear had taken root. Not just that no one would believe me, but that sharing the footage might draw attention I wasn't ready for. That somehow exposing the truth would make me a target, not just for ridicule, but for whatever was stirring in the morgue itself. I kept the evidence hidden, but every night I returned, every night I unlocked that basement door, I felt the air shift as though the dead already knew what I had seen, and the cameras kept recording. Each time the movements grew more deliberate. A hand rising higher, a head turning further. Once in the grainy light I swore I saw the faintest parting of lips, as if a whisper were forming that the microphone couldn't catch. I would sit alone with the footage, watching in the dark, until the shadows on the screen bled into the shadows of my own room. I couldn't tell which silence belonged to me anymore and which belonged to them. The morgue was no longer just where I worked. It had become the center of everything, the place where the rules I thought I understood no longer applied. And worse still, I was the only one who seemed to see it. I had my proof. But proof didn't bring peace. Proof brought responsibility. Proof meant that whatever was happening down there wasn't bound to stay hidden forever. And in the quiet hours, staring at my own trembling reflection on the camera screen, I realized something I couldn't put into words. The dead weren't just moving, they were watching. I wasn't careful enough. Up until then, I thought I could hide what I was doing. The extra notes, the cameras, the way I lingered too long in the basement staring at the drawers. I thought no one noticed. But the morgue has its own way of stripping away illusions. Down there, nothing remains hidden for long. It was the older attendant who caught me. His name doesn't matter. He had been working in the hospital longer than I'd been alive, his presence a permanent fixture of the basement corridors. He moved slowly, methodically, as though time itself bent differently around him. I always assumed he was indifferent to me. He rarely spoke, except to give curt instructions about procedure. But one evening, after I had slipped a camera behind a supply crate, I found him waiting for me at the door. He didn't accuse me outright. He didn't need to. His eyes, tired and sunken, lingered too long on the bulge of my bag where the recorder was hidden. "You're watching them," he said. His voice was quiet, not judgmental, but heavy. I froze. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to invent some excuse. But the way he said it, the certainty in his tone, made lying impossible. He gestured for me to follow. Without a word, I obeyed. We walked down a side corridor I rarely used, the kind that looped behind the refrigeration units and carried the stale scent of mildew. The walls here were older, paint peeling, tiles cracked. It felt different from the rest of the basement, like a forgotten pocket of the hospital no one bothered to maintain. He stopped in the dim light and leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable. "You've seen them move," he said. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My throat tightened, my mind scrambled. He continued before I could answer. "They all do eventually. If you stay down here long enough." The silence that followed pressed against me. The way he spoke, calm, resigned, was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. "I've worked in this basement for 40 years, he went on. Longer than most of the doctors upstairs have been alive. I've seen them twitch, open their eyes, sit upright. Sometimes just a finger, sometimes more. Always when no one else is looking. My heart pounded in my chest. Hearing my own unspoken fears laid out so plainly should have been validating, but instead it hollowed me out. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice barely audible. He shook his head.
"Why is the wrong question."
"There is no why. Not in a place like this." I waited, desperate for more, for some explanation that could anchor me. But he gave none. Instead, he told me stories. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet fragments, pieces of history spoken like a confession. This hospital wasn't built clean. They put it on top of other things. Old things. The ground underneath is layered with graves no one marked. Patients from outbreaks they never reported. Experiments they buried in silence. Every floor above us was raised over another floor of the forgotten. You think this is just a morgue? It's a sinkhole of memory. And the dead, They don't rest easy in a place like this. His eyes flickered toward the rows of drawers behind us, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't name. Some attendants ignore it, he said. Pretend it's just muscle contractions or tricks of the mind. They last the longest. Others like you start looking too closely. They don't last at all. What happens to them? I whispered. His answer came without hesitation. They disappear. The word echoed in the dim corridor, heavier than any sound I'd heard in that basement. I thought of my cameras, my notebooks, the hours I'd spent replaying footage in the dark. My chest tightened with the sudden realization that I was already too far down that path. He must have seen it on my face because he placed a hand on my shoulder, light but firm. His skin was cold, his grip steady. Stop watching, he said. Stop recording. Do your work, finish your shifts, and leave when the clock tells you to. The basement keeps its own rules, and those rules don't care about curiosity, I wanted to argue, to insist that the truth mattered, that proof was necessary, that I couldn't unsee what I had seen. But the look in his eyes silenced me. There was no anger there, no fear, only exhaustion. A man who had lived with the basement's secrets too long and knew the cost of breaking its silence. For the first time, I realized he wasn't warning me to protect himself. He was warning me to protect me. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the hum of the refrigeration units vibrating faintly through the walls. Finally, he stepped back, his hand falling from my shoulder. Go upstairs. Get some air. Don't come back down here tonight, I obeyed. When I reached the stairwell, I looked back once. He was still there in the corridor, his figure half swallowed by shadow, watching me go. That night, I didn't set up any cameras. I didn't take any notes. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. The basement keeps its own rules. I told myself I would listen, that I would stop. But even as I tried to convince myself, another thought crept in, quiet but insistent. If he had lasted 40 years down there, then what exactly had he seen in all that time? And what did it mean that he was still here when so many others had disappeared? The warning should have brought comfort. Instead, it made the silence of my own room feel like the silence of the morgue. Heavy. Watching. Waiting. The attendant's warning lingered in my head like an infection. His words should have been enough to stop me, to silence my curiosity, to make me walk through the basement with blinders on. But once you've seen the dead move, once you've recorded it with your own eyes, there's no going back. Ignorance is no longer an option. At first, I tried to follow his advice. I limited my notes, left the cameras at home, focused on routine. But the basement didn't care about my restraint. It only grew bolder. The first escalation came subtly. A drawer half opened during my shift. I swore I hadn't left it that way. My hands shook as I slid it shut, the metal rails groaning as though the morgue itself protested the motion. The second incident couldn't be explained away. I came in one evening and found a body not inside its drawer, but leaning against the wall. A corpse, its skin waxy and gray, tilted at an unnatural angle, arms limp, head slumped forward. At first I thought someone had pulled it out for examination and forgotten, but the tag was still affixed, the sheet still tucked, as though it had been carefully placed there. When I turned on the lights, the body collapsed in a heap at my feet. The sound it made was wrong, too heavy, too final, like meat dropping onto tile. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. I shoved it back into the drawer, my gloves slick with sweat beneath the latex. I told myself it had been a mistake, an oversight, a prank. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew. The bodies weren't waiting for me to watch anymore. They were advancing. Over the next week, the incidents multiplied. Small shifts turned into deliberate arrangements. Arms crossed over chests that hadn't been that way the night before. Heads turned toward the room when I entered, their jaws slack, mouths parted as though to greet me. Once I found a corpse sitting upright inside its drawer, back bent against the metal, eyes closed. When I pulled the drawer open further, it toppled forward, collapsing onto me with dead weight. The smell of cold flesh filled my nostrils, and I shoved it back with trembling hands. But the impression of its touch lingered on my chest long after. The worst was the eyes. Some nights, when I walked past the rows, I could swear they were open. Just faintly, just a slit. Glazed and unfocused, yet somehow aware. The moment I turned my head fully, the lids would be sealed again, lashes resting delicately against pallid skin. I started logging these things again, despite the attendant's warning. I couldn't help myself. Each entry was more frantic, scrawled in the margins, my handwriting devolving into jagged lines. At one point, I confronted a colleague. "Have you ever seen them change?" I asked carefully, my voice trembling. She laughed, shaking her head. "You've been down here too long. You need sunlight. Take a vacation." Her dismissal cut deeper than mockery. It left me alone with the knowledge, trapped between silence and insanity. I tried to rationalize it as sleep deprivation, hallucinations, stress. But hallucinations don't leave drawers open. Hallucinations don't rearrange bodies across shifts. The attendant avoided me now. He no longer lingered to speak, no longer offered advice. Sometimes, when our eyes met, I thought I saw pity in his expression, other times fear. The morgue grew colder. The air seemed thicker, every breath a labor. The buzzing lights overhead flickered longer, dimmer, casting shadows that seemed to stretch when I wasn't looking. One evening, I heard the sound again, the metallic scrape of a drawer sliding open. But this time it didn't stop. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping. One drawer slid outward, then another, then a third. The motion was deliberate, steady, as if pulled from within. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The air filled with the shrill whine of metal on metal, and then silence. The drawers hung open, yawning mouths waiting for me to approach. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the pen I had been holding. I forced myself to step forward. The first drawer revealed nothing unusual. A body still, draped in a sheet. The second the same. But the third drawer was empty. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the room, eyes darting to every shadow. The emptiness yawned back at me, cold and undeniable. Something was moving when I wasn't looking. That night I locked the morgue behind me with shaking hands. But the silence of the stairwell was worse, every footstep echoing like someone followed just behind. I barely slept. And when I returned the next evening, the missing body was back, tucked neatly into its drawer as though it had never left. No one else had touched it. No one else had been assigned to the basement. I was losing control. Every shift became a descent into dread. My hands sweated through gloves, my ears strained at every sound. I began to imagine I could hear breathing, faint and rhythmic, rising and falling with the hum of refrigeration units. The line between the living and the dead blurred further with each passing night. I caught myself whispering to them sometimes, asking questions I knew would never be answered, pleading for them to stop. But they didn't stop. They were learning, testing, growing bolder. And the more I tried to deny it, the more they advanced, pressing closer to the truth I didn't want to face. The morgue wasn't a resting place anymore, it was waking up. The morgue wasn't a resting place anymore. It was waking up. That truth gnawed at me as I walked the halls, as I sat alone at my desk, as I tried to eat in the break room and pretended everything was normal. The air of the basement clung to me like damp fabric no matter where I went. I carried the cold silence with me even up to the sunlit floors, into conversations with nurses and orderlies who never suspected the nightmare breathing beneath their feet. But nothing compared to the night of the storm. The rain had been pounding since my shift began, hammering the hospital roof, rattling the windows above ground. By the time I made it to the basement, I could already feel the thunder through the walls, a low vibration that hummed in my bones. The morgue, usually sealed off from the weather, felt different that night. The air was heavier, metallic, sharp with ozone. I told myself it was just another shift. Paperwork, cataloging, double-checking refrigeration temps, the same routine that should have been mindless, dull. But my nerves had been worn thin by weeks of incidents I couldn't explain. Every time I passed the rows of drawers, I looked at them too long, waiting, anticipating. The storm grew worse as the night deepened. I could hear it even in the basement. Howling winds, rain hammering vents, thunder shaking the pipes above my head. The lights flickered twice, humming louder than usual. I froze each time, staring at the ceiling like the wiring itself was about to betray me. Then, just past 2 in the morning, it happened. The lights went out, a sharp click, and then blackness. The steady hum of refrigeration units cut out, replaced by silence that pressed in on my ears. For a few seconds I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had ended. Then, with a sickly delay, the red glow of emergency lights sputtered to life. Weak, intermittent, They barely pushed back the shadows, painting everything in crimson, like the room itself was bleeding. I tried the light switch. Nothing. Tried the phone on the desk. Dead. My stomach dropped as the realization crept in. The storm had knocked out the main grid. We were on backup. That should have been temporary, except when I tried to open the morgue doors, the electronic lock didn't respond. The keypad blinked once and then went dark. I swiped my badge again and again, but the mechanism was frozen. The morgue was sealed. My throat tightened. The stairwell was behind that door, my escape route gone. I pounded the metal with my fist, hoping someone upstairs might hear. The sound echoed hollowly, swallowed by the storm, and then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal sliding. Slow, deliberate, drawer rails shrieking under weight. I turned, heart hammering so violently I thought it might break free of my chest. One drawer slid open on the far wall, the red light glinting off stainless steel. The sheet inside shifted just barely. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then another drawer opened, and another. The sound built, drawer after drawer sliding outward, a hideous chorus of grinding metal. My legs felt like they were locked in place. I wanted to run, to hide, to claw my way through the locked morgue door. But I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. I watched as the drawers extended, some halfway, some fully, until nearly the entire wall of the morgue gaped open like a mouthful of teeth. Silence fell again, thicker than before, and then came the sound of movement. Not drawers, not machinery, footsteps, faint at first, a dragging shuffle against the tile, then another, heavier, as though weight shifted from one stiff leg to another. My stomach lurched. The red lights flickered, throwing the room into brief flashes of complete darkness, each blink cutting and restoring the nightmare in front of me. I stumbled backward, my shoulder colliding with the desk. The pen I had been holding earlier rolled to the floor, clattering far too loudly in the silence. The footsteps paused. I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the red gloom, one of them was out, standing, moving. My breath rasped in my throat, too loud, too desperate. I tried to silence it by covering my mouth, but even the trembling of my fingers against my lips seemed deafening. The footsteps resumed, closer now. I ducked behind the desk, crouching low, my knees threatening to give out. The emergency lights flickered again, plunging me into pitch black for half a second. When the glow returned, I swore I saw a silhouette at the far end of the room. A figure hunched, swaying slightly, its head lolling forward. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it wasn't real. But when I opened them, the figure was closer. The smell reached me before the sound. Damp cloth, rot buried under disinfectant, a sickly sweet tang that stuck to the back of my throat. I pressed myself against the desk, trying to melt into the shadows, every nerve screaming for silence. My heartbeat was so violent I feared it would give me away. A whisper joined the storm. Not words exactly, but something like breath escaping lungs that should not have held air. A dry rasp that slithered across the room. The drawers around me gaped wider, some sheets slipping, fabric sagging as though something inside had shifted. Another drawer opened behind me with a metallic screech. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. The footsteps grew louder, more numerous. Not just one anymore. Several. I risked a glance around the desk, and what I saw made my body go cold. Figures were emerging from the open drawers, pale limbs dragging, torsos bending at impossible angles as they pulled themselves upright. Sheets fell to the floor, fabric pooling like shed skin. Their heads hung slack, jaws open, eyes dark and lifeless, but their movements were purposeful, coordinated. I ducked back, choking on bile, gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles ached. The storm raged above us, thunder booming like a war drum, rain lashing the building, but down here, the only sounds were dragging feet and the groan of bodies pulling free from drawers that were never meant to be opened. I don't know how long I stayed crouched there, shaking, my body locked between fight and flight. Seconds stretched into eternities, each flicker of the lights revealing them closer. Their forms moving slowly, deliberately, across the morgue floor. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They had all night. I had never felt smaller, more helpless, more trapped. The sealed doors, the dying lights, the storm above. It was all part of the same nightmare. the basement itself closing its jaws around me. And somewhere in that crimson gloom, I realized with a sick clarity, the morgue wasn't just waking up, it was hungry. They were hungry. That thought sat in my head like a stone, impossible to swallow, impossible to ignore. The storm outside rattled the vents, thunder shaking the pipes. But the real noise came from inside the morgue, the soft, deliberate shuffle of feet against tile. The emergency lights flickered again, and in the half-second of darkness I swore I could feel them moving closer. When the red glow returned, I dared to lift my head above the desk. One of them was staring at me, or at least, it felt like it was. Its head was angled in my direction. Chin slack, jaw unhinged just enough that the mouth hung open. The skin around its lips had dried into cracks, exposing teeth that glistened faintly in the emergency glow. Its eyes were unfocused, cloudy, filmed over with the dull haze of death, but I could feel it. Awareness. It took a step. The sound was obscene. Heel dragging, sole smearing across tile, weight shifting in stiff increments. The sheet that had covered it was still tangled around one arm, dragging along the floor like a tether. Each movement was wrong, not fluid, not natural, but deliberate nonetheless. My chest constricted. I wanted to scream, to bolt for the door, to pound until someone upstairs heard me, but the morgue door was locked, and my voice felt stolen from my throat. All I could do was crouch lower, press my back to the desk, and hope it lost interest. But the thing didn't stop. Another step. Then another. The sound of more drawers opening rippled behind it. I risked a glance sideways and saw pale forms rising from the steel compartments, their limbs bending as though unused to movement, their bodies folding and unfolding in jagged increments. One figure pulled itself fully upright, its neck jerking with an audible crack as the head tilted back into place. Another clawed at the edge of a drawer, fingernails splitting as it dragged itself free. The air grew thick with the stench of preserved flesh. Disinfectant and something older, something like damp soil, stagnant and heavy. The nearest corpse reached the edge of the desk, its hand, gray, waxy veins like faint blue threads beneath the skin, slid across the surface. The nails were chipped, yellowed, broken, leaving faint scratches in the laminate as it dragged forward. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't blink. My body was stone. Then with a sudden lurch, it bent forward. Its face tipped downward, sliding into view over the edge of the desk. I saw everything, the collapse of its cheeks, the hollow sockets beneath its eyes, the slack tongue resting against dark gums, and worst of all, the faint wheezing sound as its mouth opened wider, air moving in and out of lungs that should have been dust. I snapped. I screamed, shoving backward, my chair toppling as I scrambled on all fours across the floor. My palm slipped on tile slick with condensation. My body slammed into a cabinet, sending a rattling crash through the morgue that seemed to stir every figure into motion. The corpse leaned further, its jaw sagging impossibly wide, tendons stretching, a grotesque parody of a scream it didn't make. Behind it, others advanced, their limbs stiff but steady, their movements growing more synchronized, more purposeful. I tried to stand, my legs barely obeying. My knees buckled, but I forced myself upright, my hand clutching the edge of the cabinet for balance. "Stay back," I rasped, though my voice was barely a whisper. "Stay the hell back!" It meant nothing. They didn't react, didn't stop. Another step closer, the circle closing. I grabbed the first thing within reach, a stainless steel tray, and hurled it at the nearest corpse. It struck with a hollow clang, sliding off its shoulder, but the thing didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge it. It just kept coming, step after dragging step. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air too thick, my chest too tight. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for escape, desperate for anything. But the morgue was a cage, and I was locked inside with them. The corpse rounded the desk fully now, standing in the dim red light. Its face was inches from mine, the smell unbearable. Chemical preservative and rot mingling into a stench that seared my lungs. For the first time, its eyes moved. Not much. Just a flicker. Just enough to lock on me. My knees gave out. I slid to the floor, back pressed to the cabinet, staring up at the impossible. Tears blurred my vision. My throat locked in a strangled sob. More figures crowded behind it, their forms blotting out the faint glow of the lights. They stood shoulder to shoulder, swaying faintly, jaws open, as if waiting. Then the first one leaned closer. Its hand reached out, trembling but steady, Fingers curling toward my shoulder, I screamed again. Raw, broken, shoving myself sideways across the floor. The hand missed by inches, scraping the cabinet as I scrambled away. My palms burned as they skidded across tile, my legs scrambling for traction. The corpses followed. Not fast, not rushing, but inevitable. Every step matched my retreat, their forms moving in sync, their shadows stretching long across the walls. I stumbled into the center of the room, surrounded on all sides. The desk, the drawers, the gurneys. Every surface seemed to breathe with the weight of them. My chest hitched as I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't watching them anymore. They were watching me. The circle closed tighter. Pale hands dragged sheets across the floor, leaving damp streaks on tile. Heads tilted in broken unison, jaws sagging wider, eyes glinting faintly in the red glow. For the first time, one of them moved its mouth. Not speech, not a moan, but a wordless shape. Lips forming around the silence as if rehearsing something long forgotten. Another did the same, then another. A dozen slack mouths shaping soundless syllables, rehearsing some language of the grave. The red light flickered once, plunging everything into darkness, and when it returned, they were closer. So close I could feel their cold breath on my skin. So close I could see the faint twitch of their fingers, reaching not blindly, but with purpose. So close that there was no denying it anymore. The dead were not just stirring, they were aware, and they had found me. The moment they moved toward me in unison, survival became the only thought left in my head. I didn't think. I ran. The morgue transformed instantly into a hunting ground. Gurneys became obstacles, cabinets became barricades, shadows became traps. I shoved one metal table onto its side, sending instruments clattering across the tiles in a deafening storm of noise. The crash echoed through the chamber, but the dead didn't flinch. They simply kept advancing, slow, steady, deliberate. The red emergency lights pulsed overhead, plunging the room into alternating worlds, one drenched in color like spilled blood, the next submerged in darkness. With every flicker, their positions seemed to shift. One heartbeat, they were halfway across the room. The next, their pale faces loomed yards closer. I bolted for the far corner where the refrigeration units lined the wall. My breath tore out in ragged bursts, echoing back at me like another person gasping at my side. I spun around, convinced one of them had reached me. But the space was empty. Empty except for the unmistakable scrape of drawers sliding open again. Not behind me this time. Ahead. 3 units yawned open in perfect sequence, white sheets sliding partway out as though the bodies themselves had prepared their exit. No. My voice cracked into panic. I turned sharply, sprinting toward the side hallway, the one meant for attendants only, a narrow passage of storage closets and old equipment. My shoulder slammed against the frame as I shoved through. The impact sent lightning bolts of pain down my arm. But I didn't stop. The hallway stretched like a tunnel, lined with locked doors, each one humming faintly with the power still coursing through wires in the walls. The hum merged with the sound of my pulse, a rising roar in my ears. Then came the footsteps. At first faint, then louder. Multiple sets. I knew better than to look back, but I couldn't help it. The hallway flickered with red light just long enough for me to see them spilling into the passage. Not crawling, not stumbling, but walking. Their coordination was unbearable. Their feet struck the tiles in the same rhythm, a drumbeat of inevitability that shook the marrow of my bones. I ducked into the nearest door, praying it would give. It did. An old supply room reeking of mildew and rust. I shoved the door shut behind me and braced my weight against it, holding my breath. For a moment, silence. Then, scratching. Long, deliberate. Fingernails dragging against the wood, tracing the outline of the doorframe. I backed away, heart hammering, eyes darting across the room. Shelves, boxes, broken carts. No exit except the ceiling. A square panel, slightly ajar, sagging under years of dust. An access crawl space. I dragged a cart beneath it, climbed on top, and pushed the panel upward. My arms trembled, shoulders screaming from strain, but the panel gave. Cold air rushed down in a stale exhale. Behind me, the scratching stopped. My blood froze. I glanced down and saw the handle turn. I launched myself upward into the crawl space, dragging the panel closed just as the door creaked open. Through the thin slit, I glimpsed them spilling into the room, Faces slack, eyes unblinking, jaws working silently. The panel shut. Darkness swallowed me. I crawled through the dust-choked shaft, my breath shallow, each movement echoing far too loud. Pipes dripped above me, condensation pattering like fingers tapping the metal. But worse than the noise was the smell. The stench of rot filled the crawl space, stronger with every foot I pushed forward. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. My mind screamed the truth I didn't want to accept. They had been here before me. The shaft angled downward, depositing me into another corridor. I dropped hard onto the concrete, knees jolting with pain. My flashlight, clipped to my belt, clattered free. Its beam swept across the hallway, illuminating water stains, broken stretchers, and old paint peeling in strips. Then it illuminated something else. A trail. Dark smears across the floor, leading deeper into the hospital's underbelly. Handprints, dragging marks as though bodies had been pulled. No, had pulled themselves through here. I staggered forward, desperate to find the stairwell. Every turn I took seemed unfamiliar, as though the basement had reconfigured itself in the chaos. My lungs burned, each inhale heavier than the last, as if the very air resisted me. Behind me, the whisper started again, carried through vents, through walls, through the pipes themselves, low, rasping, inhuman. Not words, just the impression of words, as though meaning had rotted away but sound remained. I broke into a run. My flashlight beam jittered across walls, catching glimpses of doors sealed shut with rust, broken signs, and graffiti left by workers long gone. Finally, I found it. The stairwell door. I shoved it open and slammed it behind me, my chest heaving with ragged relief. The stairwell stretched upward, winding endlessly, the weak glow of emergency lights clinging to the concrete walls. I began to climb, 2 steps at a time, forcing my exhausted body upward. Each landing felt like a victory, though my muscles begged to stop, to collapse. Halfway up, I paused to suck in air, leaning against the railing. My pulse thundered in my ears, and then I heard it. Not from below, from above. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Waiting. I tilted my head upward, and in the flicker of the light on the landing above, I saw a silhouette. Broad shoulders, a limp tilt to the head, motionless but blocking the way. My stomach turned to stone, because from below the whispers rose louder. The scrape of doors opening, the echo of bodies entering the stairwell. I was caught between them, ascending death above, encroaching death below, and I realized something that hollowed me out entirely. This wasn't an escape. It was a cage. This wasn't an escape. It was a cage. That realization was the last thing I remembered before the world folded in on itself. The stairwell spun, the light smeared into streaks, and my body finally gave out. My knees buckled, my skull cracked against concrete, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I was lying on the morgue floor. The overhead fluorescence glared down at me in steady white hum, no longer the bloody pulse of the emergency lamps. The smell of bleach was sharp and clinical, scrubbing away every trace of the night before. The drawers were all closed. Every single one. For a moment I thought I had dreamed it, that my mind had unraveled under the strain of too many sleepless nights. But the soreness in my legs, the ache in my shoulders, the raw burn of my throat told me I had run. I had screamed. I had fought. The first thing I noticed was the missing notebook. The frantic entries, the scrawled records, all gone. My cameras, too. Every last one of them stripped from their hiding places. Even the dust beneath the tables was disturbed, as though someone had swept through carefully, efficiently, leaving behind only sterile emptiness. I staggered to my feet, dizzy. My uniform clung to me with the sour stink of sweat, and my gloves were gone. My bare hands trembled, streaked faintly with grime that no amount of scrubbing seemed to lift. When my colleagues arrived for their shift, I tried to explain. I told them about the storm, the blackout, the drawers opening, the corpses that moved with purpose. My words poured out in gasps, ragged and desperate. They exchanged glances. One of them laughed. "You've been pulling too many nights," she said gently, as though speaking to a child. "It gets to everyone eventually. You need rest." "No," I insisted. It wasn't exhaustion. I saw them. I heard them. Her hand touched my shoulder, firm and dismissive. "Take a few days off. Go outside. Get sunlight. This place breeds nightmares." The others nodded in agreement, already turning to their tasks. their indifference cutting sharper than any ridicule could. My voice cracked as I repeated myself, but it didn't matter. The more I tried to convince them, the less they listened. By the end of the day, the story had twisted. I overheard whispers in the hall. He had a breakdown. Working in the basement too long. Stress-induced hallucinations. It wasn't just disbelief. It was containment. Someone had made sure of that. The older attendant avoided me entirely now. He passed me in the corridor without meeting my eyes, his expression fixed, unreadable. When I cornered him, demanding answers, he shook his head once and whispered, almost inaudible, "Stop asking." That was all. Then he walked away. The silence that followed was worse than denial. I should have quit. I should have walked out and never set foot in that basement again. But something anchored me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe sheer obsession. Or maybe it was the feeling I couldn't shake. The feeling that leaving would only invite them closer. Because it wasn't just the morgue anymore. At home, I began to notice small things. The faint scrape of something shifting in the walls at night. The sense of being watched when I stood too long in the darkened kitchen. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed a half-beat too slow, as though something behind the glass were waiting. I told myself it was paranoia. Leftovers from the trauma. But deep down I knew better. The basement hadn't let me go. When I returned to work a week later, the morgue greeted me with silence so complete it felt staged. The drawers gleamed untouched. The refrigeration units hummed steadily. No flicker in the lights, no whispers in the vents. Too perfect. I forced myself to walk the length of the room, to run my hand across the smooth metal handles. Each one cold. Each one still. But when I reached the end of the row, I paused. The faintest sound. Breathing. Not mine. It came from everywhere at once, resonating in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. A low, steady rhythm, perfectly in sync with the hum of the machines. The sound of lungs that shouldn't exist. I froze. Unable to move, then it stopped. The morgue returned to silence. As though nothing had happened, I backed away, heart rattling against my ribs, every instinct screaming to run. But I didn't, I couldn't. Because in that moment I understood the truth. It wasn't about what I had seen or what I could prove. The cameras, the notes, they were irrelevant. Evidence would always vanish. Explanations would always collapse into stress and fatigue. The morgue didn't care if I believed. It only cared that I knew. Now, every time I descend those basement stairs, I feel the weight of their eyes. Behind the drawers. Behind the silence, waiting, testing. And one day soon, when the lights flicker and the storm outside drowns the world above, I know they won't stop at testing. They will advance again. And next time, I don't think I'll wake up on the morgue floor. I think I'll wake up inside.